My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old and work as a forensic financial auditor for a top-tier corporate firm. While I was thousands of miles away investigating corporate fraud, my mother secretly sold my home to pay off my sister's massive financial mess. When I finally came back and confronted my family, they laughed in my face, mocking me for being suddenly homeless. I just smiled at them. They snapped at me, asking what was so funny. I calmly replied that the property they just illegally sold was actually a federal toxic waste trap that comes with a mandatory $2.5 million cleanup bill. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust completely betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. I spent the last 6 months living out of a suitcase in London, auditing a massive tech conglomerate. The work was grueling. I was pulling 80-hour weeks buried under mountains of financial discrepancies and offshore bank records. All that kept me going was the thought of coming back to my own peaceful sanctuary in the Chicago suburbs. I bought that house 3 years ago with my own hard-earned money. It had a wraparound porch, massive oak trees in the front yard, and a custom kitchen I designed myself. It was my pride and joy. The Uber dropped me off at the end of the driveway just as the sun was starting to set. I dragged my heavy luggage up the stone walkway, feeling the familiar exhaustion of international travel deep in my bones. I could not wait to take a long hot shower and sleep for 2 solid days. I pulled my house key from my purse and slid it into the front door lock. It did not turn. I jiggled it, thinking the cold weather might have jammed the mechanism. I pulled it out and pushed it back. Nothing. The cylinder had been completely changed. Before I could even reach for my phone to call a locksmith, the door swung open. A tall, balding man in a gray sweater stood there holding a mug of coffee. We stared at each other in complete silence for a few seconds. Finally, he furrowed his brow and asked who I was and why I was trying to break into his house. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told him there must be a misunderstanding because I was the owner of this house. He looked at me like I was completely insane. He stepped back, keeping the door partially closed between us, and told me I needed to leave his property immediately or he was going to call the police. I dropped my luggage right there on the porch. I told him to go ahead and call them because someone had clearly broken into my home and changed the locks. I stood there shivering in the evening air while he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up to the curb. Two officers walked up the driveway, their hands resting on their utility belts. The man in the gray sweater stepped out onto the porch, pointing directly at me. He told the officers I was a crazy woman trying to break into his newly purchased home. I immediately pulled out my driver's license. I handed it to the taller officer and told him that this was my permanent address. I explained that I had been out of the country for 6 months on a work assignment and just got back to find a stranger living in my house. The officer looked at my ID, then looked at the man. The man shook his head and told the officers to wait right there. He went back inside and returned a minute later with a thick manila envelope. He pulled out stapled papers and handed them to the police. I watched the officer scan the front page. He let out a heavy sigh and turned to me. He said the paperwork was entirely legitimate. He said it was a legally binding deed of sale. The house had been sold exactly 3 weeks ago to a corporate holding company. My heart pounded against my ribs. I demanded to know exactly who signed the papers because I certainly did not. The officer flipped to the signature page and read the name aloud. Patricia, my own mother. The man explained that the seller used a certified power of attorney to complete the transaction on my behalf. The officer handed my ID back and told me this was a civil matter and I had to leave. I grabbed my luggage off the porch, dragged it back down the driveway, and ordered another ride. I gave the driver my mother's address in the affluent suburb of Oak Brook. During the 30-minute ride, I did not shed a single tear. I opened my laptop in the back seat connected to my mobile hotspot and began pulling up public county property records. My mind shifted out of the role of a shocked daughter and directly into the cold, calculated mindset of a corporate forensic auditor. By the time the car pulled up to my mother's sprawling colonial estate, my heart rate was perfectly steady. The street was lined with expensive cars belonging to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. Upbeat music thumped from the backyard. I left my bags in the trunk, paid the driver extra to wait, and walked up the pristine driveway. I did not bother knocking on the front door. I walked straight through the wrought iron side gate and stepped onto the massive stone patio. The rich smell of expensive ribeye steaks and grilled asparagus filled the air. About 20 family members were lounging around the heated pool holding drinks and laughing. Standing by the massive stainless steel outdoor grill was my brother-in-law, Kendrick. He was wearing a custom-fitted linen shirt and designer sunglasses. He was laughing loudly using a pair of silver tongs to flip the meat. Catching the sunlight on his left wrist was a brand new solid gold Rolex watch. It gleamed brightly against his skin, an absolutely absurd accessory for a man who claimed to be hopelessly drowning in debt just a few short weeks ago. A few feet away, my sister Stephanie was reclining on a premium outdoor sofa. She held a crystal glass of champagne in one hand and was excitedly showing her phone screen to our Aunt Susan. Stephanie was bragging loudly about an exclusive 5-star luxury resort she had just booked in the Maldives. She was celebrating the fact that her husband's business troubles were finally over, that they were completely debt-free, and that they were ready for a fresh start. I walked right into the center of the patio. The music was still playing, but the conversations around me began to rapidly die down as people noticed my presence. Stephanie looked up from her phone. Her arrogant smile vanished instantly. She nearly spilled her champagne on her designer dress as she scrambled to sit up straight. Kendrick turned around, the silver tongs freezing in midair. His eyes darted nervously between my face and the heavy gold watch on his own wrist. My mother, Patricia, stepped out of the sliding glass kitchen doors, carrying a large silver tray of appetizers. When she saw me standing there in my travel clothes, she froze entirely. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream, cry, or throw a dramatic tantrum. I simply walked over to the grill, looked at the sizzling steaks, and then looked directly into Kendrick's eyes. I calmly asked him if those prime cuts of beef were bought with the money he stole from my house. The entire patio went dead silent. The only sound left was the loud sizzling of the meat hitting the hot iron grates. Kendrick puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me with his height, but his voice cracked slightly when he told me I needed to calm down and watch my mouth in front of the family. I turned away from him dismissively and looked straight at my mother. She slowly set the silver tray down on a nearby patio table, her hands visibly shaking. I asked Patricia exactly how much cash she liquidated my property for and who exactly forged my signature on that legally binding power of attorney document. Stephanie jumped up from the sofa, her face flushing bright red with sudden anger. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and demanded to know why I was ruining a beautiful family celebration with my selfish accusations. I ignored my sister completely. I kept my eyes locked on my mother, waiting for an answer. I told Patricia I had spoken to the police just 10 minutes ago. I informed her that the new owner had successfully produced a certified deed of sale that was finalized 3 weeks prior. I asked her point blank if she genuinely thought I would never come home from my assignment in London, or if she just assumed I would roll over and accept this massive betrayal simply because she used the excuse of family. Patricia crossed her arms defensively, lifting her chin in that familiar, arrogant way she always used when she knew she was completely in the wrong, but flatly refused to ever admit it. Patricia let out a long, dramatic sigh, shifting her weight, as if I was the one being completely unreasonable. She folded her arms tightly across her chest and raised her voice so all the eavesdropping relatives on the patio could hear her twisted narrative. She claimed she had absolutely no choice in the matter. She told the entire gathering that Kendrick had gotten caught up with a dangerous underground cartel. According to my mother, these ruthless men were demanding $180,000, and they had threatened to end Kendrick's life if he did not pay them immediately. Patricia's voice trembled with fake emotion as she played the ultimate martyr. She said she could not just sit by and let her daughter become a young widow. She completely justified forging my signature on the power of attorney by claiming that a mother always has the moral authority to redistribute family assets in a life or death crisis. She added that I was unreachable in London anyway, too busy climbing the corporate ladder to care about my own flesh and blood. She actually looked me in the eye and said she sold my property to save a life, acting as though I should be thanking her for stepping in. I stared at her, completely processing the sheer magnitude of her delusion. Before I could even respond to this fabricated cartel story, Stephanie marched over and stood right next to our mother. Stephanie tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder and glared at me with absolute contempt. She told me to stop being so incredibly selfish and materialistic. She said I was a single woman with no husband and no children, meaning I had absolutely no real use for a massive luxury house with a wraparound porch anyway. Stephanie pointed out that I made a high salary at my auditing firm and could easily just rent a nice apartment downtown. She actually laughed a sharp, mocking sound and told me that just because I was technically homeless now did not mean the world was ending. She said I was overreacting to a minor inconvenience. She patted Kendrick on the arm and proudly announced that my house had given her family the clean slate they deserved, allowing them to finally book that luxury vacation to the Maldives without any guilt. The sheer entitlement radiating from my sister was almost suffocating. The other family members on the patio were nodding along, completely buying into Patricia and Stephanie's twisted version of reality. My mother then turned around, picked up her expensive designer handbag from the patio chair, and began digging through it. She pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a fancy silver pen. She quickly scribbled a number, ripped the check from the booklet, and shoved it directly into my hand. She told me it was a check for exactly $2,000. She explained that after paying off the dangerous men, settling Kendrick's urgent legal fees, and giving Stephanie a small financial cushion to recover from the severe emotional distress of the whole ordeal, this was the remaining balance from the sale of my house. She told me to take the leftovers and put it toward a security deposit on a small rental unit. She literally told me to be grateful she managed to save me anything at all. As a forensic financial auditor, my entire career is built on detecting lies, identifying financial inconsistencies, and tracking hidden assets. Standing on that patio, it took my brain less than 10 seconds to completely dismantle their ridiculous story. A man who just paid off a violent cartel does not immediately purchase a solid gold Rolex and prime ribeye steaks. A family recovering from a life-threatening financial crisis does not book a five-star resort in the Maldives. They were lying, and they were not even smart enough to hide the evidence. I looked down at the crisp paper in my hand. $2,000. That was what my mother thought my entire estate, my peace of mind, and my absolute trust were worth. I slowly looked up from the check, past my mother's defiant glare, past my sister's smug, arrogant face, and locked eyes directly with Kendrick. He was still standing by the grill, but he was no longer smiling. I did not scream. I did not tear the check into pieces or throw it in my mother's face. Instead, I felt a genuine deep chuckle rise up from my chest. I started to smile, a wide, genuine smile that completely unsettled the atmosphere on the patio. Stephanie crossed her arms, her face contorting with sudden anger and deep insecurity. She snapped at me, visibly irritated, demanding to know what was so funny about losing my home. I looked right at her, my smile never fading. I replied that the house they sold was actually the biggest mistake of their entire lives. At that exact moment, the confident posture completely vanished from Kendrick's body. He dropped the silver tongs onto the stone patio with a loud clatter. His jaw tightened, and a visible bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He knew I investigated financial crimes for a living, and in that split second he realized I was not a victim at all. The silence stretched heavily across the sunlit patio. Kendrick bent down to pick up the silver tongs he had dropped, his hands shaking just slightly before he tightened his grip. He tried to quickly mask his sudden panic with a loud, forced laugh that echoed awkwardly off the brick walls of the house. He puffed out his chest again, stepping toward me with a swagger that felt completely manufactured. He told me I was bluffing and just trying to ruin their beautiful family day with empty threats. I did not break eye contact with him. I simply extended my right hand palm up and told him to show me the power of attorney document. I kept my voice incredibly calm. I told him that if he was so confident in his completely legal real estate transaction, he would have absolutely no problem showing a professional forensic auditor the physical paperwork right now. Patricia stepped forward, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, as if she was shielding herself from my words. She immediately went on the defensive. She said the paperwork was locked away safely, and I had no right to demand anything from them in her home. But Kendrick held up a hand to stop her. His massive ego simply could not handle backing down in front of the entire family. He told my mother it was fine, wiped his hands aggressively on a cloth towel, and walked over to a leather briefcase sitting on one of the outdoor lounge chairs. He unzipped it, rummaged inside, and pulled out a thick manila folder. He strutted back over to me and practically shoved a stapled stack of papers directly into my hand. He smirked confidently, pointing a thick finger at the embossed stamp at the very bottom of the last page. He proudly announced that the document was completely ironclad. He boasted that it was stamped sealed and legally recorded by a certified county notary who happened to be a very close personal friend of his. He told me I could take that paper to any judge in the entire state of Illinois, and they would laugh me right out of the courtroom. I took the papers and scanned the first page. The formatting was entirely standard, likely downloaded from a generic legal template website and filled out in a rush. Then I flipped directly to the signature page. As a financial auditor, my eyes are trained to spot discrepancies that normal people gloss over. I did not need a magnifying glass or a laboratory to see the glaring mistakes jumping off the page. First, I looked at the date next to my alleged signature. It was dated October 14th. I calmly looked up at Kendrick and asked him if he knew exactly where I was on October 14th. He rolled his eyes, let out an exasperated sigh, and said I was in London. I smiled and corrected him. I told him that on October 14th, I was actually on a 14-hour transatlantic flight over the ocean with absolutely no Wi-Fi and no physical capability to be in an office signing a legal document in front of a notary. Kendrick shifted his weight, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, waving his hand dismissively. He claimed it was just a minor clerical error by his notary friend and that dates get mixed up all the time on official paperwork. But I was not finished. I tapped my index finger directly on the blue ink of my forged signature. I pointed out that whoever signed my name used a sweeping dramatic loop on the letter T. I explained to my captive audience that I have never crossed my T with a loop in my entire life. I told them that every single bank record, tax return, and corporate document I have ever signed would instantly prove this was a crude amateur forgery. I also read the name of the notary stamped at the bottom. It was a man named Darnell. I recognized that name immediately. Darnell was the exact same shady business associate who had helped Kendrick set up his failed cryptocurrency company 2 years ago. Stephanie marched forward, grabbing her husband's arm defensively. She shouted that I was just making up technicalities because I was bitter about losing the house. Patricia eagerly joined in telling me to stop playing pretend detective and accept reality. Any normal person would have pulled out their phone and dialed 911 right then and there to report criminal fraud. Having them arrested for forgery would have been completely justified. But looking at their arrogant, entitled faces, I realized that calling the police now would be far too easy for them. A quick arrest would stop them from making any more financial moves, and they would likely just get a slap on the wrist for a first-time offense. I wanted them to feel totally secure in their victory. I wanted them to dig their own graves so deep that they could never climb out. I closed the folder and calmly handed it back to Kendrick. I told him he had a very interesting definition of ironclad. I picked up the $2,000 check my mother had thrown at me earlier and ripped it into tiny pieces, letting them flutter down onto the expensive stone patio. I looked at the three of them one last time, told them to enjoy their stolen steaks, and turned around to leave. As I walked back down the driveway toward my waiting car, I knew exactly what my next move would be. It was time to completely dismantle the fake cartel debt story and expose Kendrick for the absolute fraud he truly was. I reached the trunk of my waiting car, but my hand hovered over the cold metal handle. I could hear Kendrick's booming laugh echoing from the backyard, immediately recovering his bravado the second he thought I was gone. I realized I could not let them enjoy their expensive steaks. I could not let them clink their crystal glasses and celebrate stealing my sanctuary. I opened the car door, pulled my heavy work laptop from my carry-on bag, and walked right back up the long driveway. When I stepped back onto the patio, their confident smiles vanished instantly. I did not say a single word to anyone. I marched straight to the large glass outdoor dining table, pushed aside a massive ceramic bowl of potato salad, and slammed my laptop down right in the middle of it. Patricia marched over and demanded to know what I was doing, warning me that I was making an absolute fool of myself in front of our guests. I completely ignored her. I flipped open the screen and woke up the system. My proprietary forensic auditing software. The exact same highly classified program my firm uses to track international corporate money laundering was already running from my work on the long flight. I looked up at Kendrick. I asked him what the exact name of this highly dangerous underground cartel was. I asked if they had a corporate tax identification number or if they preferred untraceable offshore wire transfers. Kendrick's face turned completely ashen. He stammered frantically, telling my mother to call security and get me off the property, but his feet were glued to the spot. He was entirely paralyzed by fear. I turned my attention back to the bright screen. I did not need his answer anyway. I already had the name of the shady notary, which led me straight to the limited liability company Kendrick used to facilitate the fraudulent sale of my house. My fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard. The family stood around the table in dead silence, watching complex lines of financial data scroll rapidly across my monitor. Within 3 short minutes, I broke through the basic privacy shields of his amateur holding company. I found the exact paper trail of the house sale, and right beneath it, I found the massive outgoing wire transfer, exactly $180,000. I kept my eyes on the screen and announced my findings to the dead silent patio. I stated that the money did not go to a dangerous criminal organization. It went to a newly registered corporate entity based in Nevada. I ran a rapid cross-reference on the managing director of that specific Nevada company. A single name popped up on the public registry. I turned my laptop screen around so it faced my sister perfectly. I read the name out loud. Amber. Stephanie frowned, her perfectly manicured fingers nervously touching her diamond necklace. She asked who Amber was. I did not answer with words. I quickly pulled up Amber's public social media profile and expanded the photo gallery onto the full screen. Amber was a 20-something fitness influencer who aggressively promoted a blatantly obvious cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme to her vulnerable followers. But that was not the worst part of the profile. I clicked on a high-resolution photo posted just 4 weeks ago. It was a picture of Amber on a white sand beach in Miami, wrapped tightly around her waist, wearing the exact same designer sunglasses he had on right now was Kendrick. The caption underneath the photo read, "Celebrating big investments with my favorite guy." I looked straight at Stephanie and reminded her that 4 weeks ago Kendrick claimed he was attending a mandatory real estate conference in Florida. The heavy crystal champagne glass slipped right through Stephanie's fingers. It hit the stone patio and shattered into dozens of pieces. The sharp, violent sound made Patricia gasp loudly and cover her mouth in shock. Kendrick lunged forward across the table, desperately trying to slam my laptop shut, but I swiftly pulled it out of his reach. I looked at my sister, whose face had drained of all color. I calmly explained that her husband was never in danger of losing his life to violent criminals. He was just a gullible, unfaithful fool who handed over a massive fortune to his mistress's online scam. I told her they stole my property and forged my name not to save a life, but to cover up his blatant infidelity and absolute financial incompetence. For a brief moment, I actually felt a tiny flicker of pity for Stephanie. Her entire perfect life was exposed as a complete lie in front of all our relatives. But that pity vanished in the very next second. Instead of turning around and slapping her cheating husband, Stephanie's shock morphed into a blinding, irrational rage directed entirely at me. She stepped right over the broken glass, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure hatred, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She did not yell at Kendrick for betraying her. She screamed at me for invading his privacy. She blamed me for humiliating him in front of the entire family. She shrieked that I was just a bitter, jealous woman who was actively trying to ruin her beautiful marriage because I could not find a successful man of my own. She pointed a shaking finger right at my face, screaming that I was the one destroying this family. I stood perfectly still, letting Stephanie's unhinged screaming wash over me. Any rational human being would have turned their fury on the husband who just squandered their life savings on a fraudulent scheme run by his young mistress. But in my family, logic had never been part of the equation. Instead of confronting Kendrick, Stephanie directed every ounce of her venom at the messenger. She continued to shriek, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the estate, demanding that I pack up my laptop and get off the property before she called the police on me for cyber harassment. Before I could process the absolute absurdity of her threat, Patricia marched right into the center of the chaos. I thought for a split second that my mother might finally show some maternal instinct and comfort her betrayed daughter. I was completely wrong. Patricia wrapped her arms fiercely around Stephanie, glaring at me with a look of absolute disgust. She did not yell at Kendrick. She did not ask him to explain the massive wire transfer or the photo of him on the beach. Instead, my mother turned her wrath entirely on me. Patricia slammed her hand down on the glass dining table, shaking the plates. She told me I was a cold, calculating monster who lacked any basic human empathy. She declared that a good wife stands by her husband through financial mistakes, and that my lack of understanding was the exact reason I was 34 years old and entirely alone. She actually looked me in the eye and defended Kendrick, claiming that the pressure of providing for a family can drive men to make foolish investments. She said that bringing up his indiscretions in front of the entire family was an act of pure evil, meant only to destroy my sister's happiness. I looked at the three of them. Kendrick was hiding behind the two women, not saying a single word. Patricia pointed her finger sharply toward the wrought iron side gate. Her voice trembled with rage as she told me to get out of her sight. She said I was a toxic presence who could not stand to see anyone else succeed. And then she delivered the final blow, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She told me that from this moment forward, I was no longer her daughter. She looked me dead in the eyes and said I was entirely dead to her. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply closed my laptop, slid it smoothly back into my bag, and turned around. As I walked back down the long driveway toward my waiting car, I felt a strange, profound sense of liberation. The heavy chain of familial obligation had just been completely shattered. I climbed into the back seat of the car and instructed the driver to take me to a downtown hotel. We were barely 5 minutes down the road when my phone started buzzing continuously. It was an absolute avalanche of notifications. I pulled the phone out and saw my screen lighting up with angry messages from my aunts, uncles, and cousins who had just been at the barbecue. I swiped open my notifications and saw the source of the chaos. Patricia had gone live on Facebook. I tapped the video link and watched my mother perform the greatest acting role of her entire life. The camera focused entirely on Patricia's tear-stained face. In the background, Stephanie was dramatically sobbing into a tissue while Kendrick stood beside her, looking appropriately somber. My mother was speaking directly to her hundreds of friends and our entire extended family. She spun a masterful, entirely fabricated narrative. She told the camera that I had returned from Europe completely unhinged. She claimed that I was furious about the house being sold to save Kendrick from his terrible business debt, and in a fit of pure jealousy, I had fabricated awful lies about his fidelity to tear their marriage apart. She cried fake tears as she described how I ruthlessly hacked into their private accounts just to publicly humiliate my sister. Patricia begged everyone watching to pray for Stephanie and Kendrick during this difficult time. She ended the video by publicly disowning me, urging our entire extended family to completely block my number and protect themselves from my toxic behavior. I watched the live viewer count climb, and the angry comments flood the screen. People I had known my entire life were calling me a sociopath and a terrible sister. They were buying every single word. But as I sat there watching my mother actively try to destroy my reputation, I did not feel a shred of panic. I just felt cold clarity. If Patricia wanted to treat me like I was dead to her, then she was about to learn a very harsh financial lesson. I closed the Facebook app, opened my secure mobile banking portal, and prepared to cut the main artery of her luxurious lifestyle. The ride to the downtown hotel felt incredibly peaceful compared to the circus I had just left behind. My phone continued to vibrate violently against the leather seat, a relentless drumbeat of family outrage. I picked it up and scrolled through the incoming text messages. Aunt Susan, who just 30 minutes ago was smiling at me over a plate of grilled asparagus, sent a long paragraph calling me a bitter, jealous spinster who was actively trying to ruin my sister's life because I could not find a man. My cousin Kevin told me I was dead to him. Even Uncle Robert, who rarely spoke at family gatherings, chimed in to say I was a massive disappointment to the family name and that I needed to seek intense psychiatric help. My mother's theatrical performance on Facebook Live was working perfectly. She had successfully weaponized our entire extended family against me in record time. A younger version of myself would have been completely devastated by this barrage of hatred. I would have drafted long, desperate apologies trying to explain the truth and begging for their understanding. But the woman sitting in the back of that town car was a seasoned forensic auditor. I looked at their angry messages the exact same way I looked at fraudulent corporate ledger entries. They were simply bad investments. And when an investment turns toxic, the only logical business move is to liquidate the asset and completely cut your losses. I opened my secure mobile banking application. The blue glow of the screen illuminated the dark back seat of the car. I navigated past my checking and savings accounts and clicked directly into my premium platinum credit portfolio. 5 years ago, when my auditing career really started taking off and my bonuses grew substantial, Patricia came to me crying about how tight her fixed income was. She played the devoted, struggling mother card perfectly. She claimed she just needed a tiny financial safety net for absolute emergencies like medical bills or unexpected car repairs. Being the dutiful, successful daughter, I authorized 3 supplementary platinum credit cards in her name, tied directly to my primary account. Naturally, her definition of a financial emergency quickly expanded. Over the last 5 years, those cards became the secret engine powering Patricia's entire luxurious lifestyle. I watched the transaction history load on my screen. Just this past month, she had charged $400 at an upscale hair salon, $600 at a designer boutique, and $200 at a high-end wine merchant. She was using my hard-earned money to buy the very same champagne Stephanie was drinking when she mocked me for being homeless. I had let it slide for years, writing it off as the cost of keeping the peace in a highly dysfunctional family. But there was no peace left to keep. I tapped on the first supplementary card ending in 4201. This was the card she used for her daily expenses and her expensive organic groceries. I clicked the Manage Card option, scrolled down to the security settings, and pressed Deactivate. A prompt popped up on the screen asking if I was sure I wanted to permanently cancel this line of credit. I pressed Confirm without a single moment of hesitation. The screen refreshed and the card icon turned gray, one down. I moved to the second card, the one ending in 8894. This was her favorite piece of plastic. It was the card she used to cover her expensive dinners with her country club friends, maintaining the grand illusion that she was a wealthy, independent matriarch. I clicked Deactivate, selected Unauthorized User from the drop-down menu, and hit Confirm, two down. Finally, I clicked on the third card. The Emergency Platinum Reserve. I knew for a fact she had linked this specific card to her primary rideshare applications, her online shopping accounts, and her monthly country club membership dues. I stared at the deactivate button for a few seconds. I thought about the $2,000 check she had literally thrown at my feet. I thought about her looking me in the eye and telling me I was dead to her while standing next to the man who stole my house. I pressed confirm. The entire supplementary portfolio was instantly wiped out. I locked my phone and leaned my head back against the cool leather seat. The heavy burden of financially supporting people who actively despised me was officially gone. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt incredibly light. The driver pulled up to the grand entrance of a luxury downtown hotel and opened my door. I tipped him generously, checked into a premium suite, and ordered a massive room service dinner just for myself. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, completely silencing the endless stream of family outrage. I took a long hot shower and washed the smell of their barbecue smoke out of my hair. I knew exactly what Patricia's schedule looked like for the following day. She was hosting her monthly high society luncheon at her exclusive country club, and tomorrow, when the waiter brought the expensive bill to the table, my mother was going to find out exactly what it actually means to be dead to someone. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in 6 months. The massive king-sized bed in my hotel suite was a welcome upgrade from the cramped airplane seats and sterile corporate housing I had been enduring in London. I ordered a lavish room service breakfast, poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, and set up my work laptop by the floor, to ceiling windows overlooking the downtown Chicago skyline. I had a mountain of corporate audits to catch up on, but part of my attention remained firmly fixed on the digital clock in the corner of my screen. I knew my mother's Wednesday schedule down to the absolute minute. Every Wednesday at exactly 1 in the afternoon, Patricia hosted a high society luncheon at the Oak Brook Country Club. For years, she had used these lavish weekly gatherings to cement her status among the affluent suburban elites. She would sit at the center table on the veranda, surrounded by women dripping in diamonds and designer labels, and she would pick up the tab for everyone. It was her favorite power move. She loved the performative aspect of carelessly dropping a premium platinum card onto the leather check presenter while her friends gushed over her absolute generosity. Of course, none of those wealthy women knew that the platinum card was tied directly to my bank account. They thought Patricia was an independent matriarch with a massive investment portfolio. At exactly 1:45, my personal phone lit up silently on the glass desk. A push notification from my banking application appeared on the screen. It was an automated fraud prevention alert. The message stated that a transaction for $1,520 at the Oak Brook Country Club dining room had been declined on the card, ending in 4201. I took a slow sip of my coffee and smiled. I could picture the exact scene unfolding miles away. Patricia confidently handing the card to the tuxedo-clad waiter, continuing her boastful conversation, only to have the waiter return a few minutes later, leaning in respectfully to whisper that the card did not go through. 2 minutes later, a second notification flashed across my screen. A declined transaction for the exact same amount this time, attempted on the card ending in 8894. Patricia was panicking now. I knew her heart was pounding against her ribs as she fumbled through her designer handbag, trying to maintain her composed smile while handing over her backup card. When that second card failed, the illusion began to crack. Less than a minute after that, the third notification appeared. The emergency reserve card had been declined. The entire supplementary portfolio was completely dead. 10 seconds later, my phone began to vibrate aggressively across the desk. The caller ID flashed Patricia's name in bright red letters. I let it ring 3 times before I casually swiped to accept the call. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, panicked breathing on the other end of the line. Patricia's voice was a harsh, frantic whisper. She was clearly hiding in the country club restroom or standing in a secluded corner of the lobby. She demanded to know what was wrong with the credit cards. She said she was standing in front of her entire social circle, the waiter was waiting at the table, and she looked like an absolute fool. She ordered me to call the bank immediately, unlock the accounts, and fix whatever technical glitch was causing this massive embarrassment. She even had the audacity to tell me that we could discuss my terrible behavior from yesterday after she paid her bill, as if she was doing me a massive favor by allowing me to finance her lifestyle. I listened to her desperate demands, my expression completely blank. I let a few seconds of heavy silence pass between us, ensuring she felt the full weight of her situation. Then I spoke in a calm, even tone. I reminded her of the exact words she had screamed at me in front of our entire family less than 24 hours ago. I told her that she had looked me dead in the eyes and declared that I was no longer her daughter. I reminded her that she had publicly stated I was entirely dead to her. I took a deep breath and delivered the reality check she desperately needed. I said that dead people do not pay for country club mimosas. Before she could scream, cry, or beg, I ended the call. I did not just hang up. I went straight into my phone settings and permanently blocked her number. I blocked Stephanie's number. I blocked Kendrick's number. I sat back in my plush hotel chair and looked out over the city. Miles away, Patricia was being forced to walk back to a table of wealthy, judgmental women and admit she did not have a dime to her name. She would have to ask women who secretly thrived on suburban gossip to cover her expensive lunch. By the time the sun set, the entire Oak Brook Country Club would know that Patricia was completely broke. The financial umbilical cord was officially cut, but my work was far from over. Kendrick still had my house, and it was time to let him hang himself with it. I spent the rest of the afternoon diving back into my corporate audit files, enjoying the absolute silence in my hotel suite. The lack of ringing phones and incoming guilt trips was pure bliss. I knew exactly what was happening back in the affluent suburbs. Patricia was undoubtedly scrambling, trying desperately to explain her newly declined credit cards to her wealthy country club friends, while simultaneously realizing she had zero access to the endless funds she had relied on for half a decade. But cutting off my mother was only the very first phase of the cleanup. The real target was Kendrick. With Patricia completely out of money, the Bank of Mom was permanently closed for business. Kendrick had already blown the initial $180,000 on his mistress's cryptocurrency scam. He had a brand new, solid gold watch but absolutely zero liquid cash to maintain his fake baller lifestyle. I knew that a desperate scammer backed into a financial corner would inevitably make a massive, greedy mistake. I just had to wait for him to make his move. It did not take long at all. Later that evening, while I was reviewing a quarterly spreadsheet for a client, my personal phone lit up on the glass desk. Since I had permanently blocked Patricia, Stephanie, and Kendrick across all my devices, I was only receiving communications from verified contacts. But this notification was a text message from a completely unknown number with a local Chicago area code. I swiped the screen open and read the message. The sheer arrogance of the text instantly confirmed the sender's identity. Kendrick had apparently borrowed a friend's phone or bought a cheap prepaid burner device specifically to bypass my block and continue his relentless harassment. The message began with a long string of laughing emojis, followed by a massive gloating paragraph. He told me I was incredibly petty for cutting off an old woman's credit cards just because I was bitter about losing my house. He bragged that my little financial temper tantrum did not matter anymore because he had officially moved on to the big leagues. Attached to the text message was a high-resolution screenshot of a financial document. I tapped the image to expand it, my trained auditor eyes instantly scanning the corporate letterhead. It was an official pre-approval notice from a major federally insured national bank. The document was addressed directly to Kendrick's shady shell company, Apex Holding Limited. My eyes tracked down to the loan details, and a cold laugh escaped my lips. Kendrick had officially applied for a massive cash-out equity loan against the property he just stole from me. The approved loan amount was a staggering $500,000. He was leveraging the property deed he acquired through sheer forgery to pull $500,000 of pure cash directly out of the banking system. Beneath the screenshot, another text message popped up on my screen. Kendrick boasted that he was a true real estate mogul. He mocked me, saying that while I was crying in a lonely hotel room, he was using my former asset to build a massive financial empire. He told me to enjoy renting a tiny apartment while he cashed a $500,000 check by the end of the week. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. Kendrick thought he was delivering a devastating blow to my ego. He truly believed he was proving his absolute superiority by rubbing this massive loan approval in my face. But in reality, he had just voluntarily handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him completely. If he had simply kept the property and tried to live in it, I would have had to drag him through a slow, tedious civil court process to evict him and definitively prove the forgery. It would have taken months, maybe even years of expensive legal battles and family drama. But Kendrick's insatiable greed had just changed the entire playing field in a matter of seconds. By walking into a major national bank and applying for a massive commercial loan using a forged deed, he was no longer just dealing in petty family theft. Applying for a cash-out refinance using fraudulently acquired collateral is a direct violation of severe federal banking laws. He had just sprinted across the line into serious criminal territory. He was actively committing federal bank fraud and wire fraud, which are high-level felonies that carry mandatory minimum federal prison sentences. My brother-in-law was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need for quick cash that he had willingly placed his own head directly into a federal noose. He had literally provided me with written digital proof of his intent to defraud a federally insured institution. I did not text him back with an angry paragraph. I did not threaten to call the police or warn him that he was making a fatal mistake. I simply replied to his unknown burner number with a single simple thumbs-up emoji. I wanted him to feel completely invincible. I wanted him to proceed with the bank loan closing as fast as humanly possible. Because the higher he climbed his imaginary mountain of wealth, the more devastating the drop was going to be when the federal government finally pulled the ground right out from under his feet. While Kendrick was busy signing away his freedom with the federal bank, I decided it was time to address the other massive elephant in the room: his fitness influencer mistress Amber. The $500,000 loan was a brilliant trap, but federal investigations take time to process. I wanted my sister to experience the immediate visceral reality of her husband's betrayal. I opened my laptop and pulled up Amber's public profile. Influencers are incredibly predictable. They document every single second of their lives for public consumption. A quick scan of her recent posts revealed she was not in Nevada anymore. She was right here in Chicago, staying at a luxury boutique hotel on the Magnificent Mile, undoubtedly funded by the money stolen from my house. But what caught my trained eye was not her location. It was the massive custom diamond pendant resting against her collarbone in her latest video. I recognized that specific piece immediately. It was a limited edition necklace from a high-end jeweler. I had seen the exact receipt for it when I breached Kendrick's shell company records. He had spent $30,000 of my house money on that necklace just 3 days ago. Kendrick was parading around pretending to be a wealthy crypto genius, but he was really just a desperate thief trying to buy the affection of a woman 10 years his junior. Amber's social media story updated with a live location tag. She was enjoying an expensive afternoon tea at an upscale bistro just 2 blocks from my hotel. I knew exactly how to use this information. I bought a cheap prepaid burner phone from a convenience store down the street. I typed out a brief anonymous text message and sent it directly to Stephanie's personal number. I wrote that her husband's mistress was currently sitting on the patio of the bistro, wearing the exact diamond necklace Kendrick bought with the cartel money. I knew my sister perfectly. Her fragile ego had been shattered by the revelation at the barbecue, but she had directed all her anger at me because it was easier than facing the truth. She needed to see the truth standing right in front of her. Less than 20 minutes later, I walked down the street and took a seat inside a quiet coffee shop directly across from the bistro. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Right on schedule, Stephanie's luxury SUV aggressively hopped the curb and parked illegally in a loading zone. Stephanie stormed out of the vehicle wearing oversized sunglasses and a designer trench coat. She marched straight onto the crowded outdoor patio of the bistro, her head swiveling as she scanned the tables. It did not take her long to find her target. Amber was sitting at a premium corner table taking a selfie with a tower of expensive pastries. The sunlight caught the massive diamond pendant around her neck, making it sparkle brilliantly. Stephanie walked right up to the table and slammed her hands down on the marble surface, knocking a delicate teacup onto the ground. The sharp sound of shattering porcelain caused the entire patio to fall completely silent. I watched through the window as Stephanie pointed a shaking finger directly at Amber's chest. She did not bother keeping her voice down. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know where Amber got that necklace. Amber looked up completely unfazed by the sudden aggressive intrusion. She slowly lowered her phone, smiled a sickeningly sweet smile, and loudly announced that her amazing boyfriend Kendrick bought it for her to celebrate their new real estate venture together. Stephanie completely lost her mind. She shrieked that Kendrick was a married man and that the necklace was bought with stolen money. She lunged forward, trying to physically snatch the diamonds right off Amber's neck. Amber immediately stood up, swatting Stephanie's hand away with incredible force. A vicious, entirely public screaming match erupted between them. Amber laughed directly in my sister's face, loudly mocking her for being a naive, washed-up housewife who could not keep her own husband satisfied. Amber bragged that Kendrick spent more money on her in a single week than he had on Stephanie in their entire marriage. She detailed expensive hotel suites, luxury cars, and private flights, practically shouting the financial receipts for everyone on the patio to hear. Diners were pulling out their phones, recording the humiliating spectacle. Waiters rushed forward, frantically trying to separate the two screaming women before it escalated into a physical brawl. I sat comfortably by the window across the street, taking a slow sip of my warm coffee. The carefully constructed illusion of my sister's perfect marriage was currently being broadcast to the internet by dozens of strangers. Kendrick's house of cards was collapsing in real time, and the best part was that I did not even have to raise my voice to make it happen. The public humiliation was exactly what Stephanie deserved. I finished my coffee, left a generous tip on the table, and walked the 2 short blocks back to my hotel. The crisp afternoon air felt incredibly refreshing. Watching the spectacular public implosion of my sister's marriage had given me a massive surge of energy. I took the elevator up to my suite, fully prepared to dive back into my corporate client files and enjoy a quiet evening. But my peace was incredibly short-lived. About an hour later, a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed through my hotel room door. Someone was hitting the heavy wood so hard it was rattling the frame. I walked over and checked the peephole. Standing in the hallway looking completely unhinged were Patricia and Stephanie. Stephanie's expensive designer trench coat was wrinkled, her hair was a mess, and her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks from crying. Patricia was standing right behind her, gripping her luxury handbag so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I seriously debated calling hotel security right then and there, but I knew exactly why they had tracked me down. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before I could even say a single word, Patricia shoved her way into my room, practically dragging Stephanie behind her. Patricia pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. She screamed that I had finally crossed the line and gone way too far. She furiously accused me of hiring a private investigator to stalk Kendrick, setting up that humiliating public ambush at the bistro, and maliciously freezing her credit accounts just to starve her out of spite. Stephanie sobbed loudly, stepping forward to yell that I had officially destroyed her life. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, waving it frantically in the air. She shrieked that she was calling the Chicago police right this exact second to file a massive restraining order against me for severe cyber harassment and malicious stalking. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands defensively. I just let them exhaust their vocal cords. I watched Stephanie hover her trembling thumb over the dial pad, desperately trying to intimidate me into apologizing. I calmly looked her in the eye and told her to go ahead and call them. I said the police arriving would actually save me a trip downtown later this week. Stephanie hesitated, her thumb freezing over the screen. That tiny moment of doubt was all I needed. I walked over to the glass desk where my work laptop was sitting. Right next to it was a thick, freshly printed stack of documents I had compiled earlier that morning, using my firm's auditing software. It was a complete, undeniable forensic paper trail. I picked up the heavy legal dossier, walked back over, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table right in front of them. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud that made them both jump. I told Stephanie she needed to stop crying over a $30,000 diamond necklace and start worrying about serving mandatory federal prison time. Patricia scoffed loudly, calling me a delusional liar. I completely ignored my mother and instructed Stephanie to look at the very first page of the stack. Stephanie cautiously reached down and picked up the documents. I explained exactly what she was holding in clear, clinical terms. I told her that the company that supposedly bought my house, Apex Holding Limited, was not some random corporate investor. I pointed directly to the business and corporation documents registered in the state of Nevada. The sole managing director listed on the official state paperwork was Kendrick. I watched the color completely drain from Patricia's face as the severe reality of the situation began to set in. I explained the entire scam to them. I said Kendrick used the forged power of attorney to literally sell my house to himself. He used the imaginary cartel debt as a convenient excuse to pocket the fake purchase money, laundered it through his own shell company, and was now using that exact same fraudulent deed to take out a massive $500,000 commercial equity loan from a federally insured bank. I stepped closer to my sister and lowered my voice. I told Stephanie that when the federal banking authorities inevitably audit this massive loan, they will not just look at Kendrick. They will look directly at her. As his legal spouse and as someone who has actively benefited from the stolen funds to buy designer clothes and book luxury vacations, she is legally complicit in wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal money laundering. I then turned my gaze to Patricia. I added that the police would also be extremely interested in the mother who knowingly facilitated the forged power of attorney to kick off the entire criminal enterprise in the first place. Stephanie dropped the papers onto the floor like they were on fire. The sheer, unadulterated panic in her eyes was absolute perfection. Her arrogant threat of calling the police had completely evaporated. I walked over to the hotel room door and pulled it wide open. I told them they had exactly 10 seconds to get out of my suite before I called hotel security and had them physically removed for trespassing. I added that if they still wanted to call the police, I would happily hand this exact printed dossier directly to the responding officers. They stumbled out into the hallway without saying another word, leaving the damning evidence scattered across my floor. I locked the hotel door and listened to their frantic footsteps disappearing down the hallway. The dossier had done its job. I knew my mother and sister were terrified, but I also knew Kendrick's massive ego would never let him surrender. He was still banking on that $500,000 equity loan to magically fix all his problems, pay off his young mistress, and keep up his lavish public charade. But commercial banking moves methodically, and I knew exactly what the next mandatory step in his loan approval process had to be. A federally insured bank cannot authorize a massive cash-out refinance without sending a licensed appraiser to physically inspect the property. He needed that appraisal report to be absolutely spotless. When I bought that house 3 years ago, the main floor was perfect, but the basement was a completely different story. The previous owner had attempted a chaotic renovation, knocking down load-bearing walls and messing with the main electrical panel without pulling a single city permit. I had intentionally left the basement locked and untouched, planning to hire a professional contractor to properly gut it later. Kendrick did not know any of this. To him, the house was just a giant piggy bank ready to be smashed open. I picked up my newly purchased burner phone and dialed the direct emergency hotline for the municipal building and zoning department. I did not give my name. I simply stated that I was a concerned neighbor reporting highly dangerous, unpermitted structural work and exposed electrical hazards currently happening at the property. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. Using the online public property tracking portal, I saw that Kendrick's bank appraiser was scheduled to arrive at the house the very next morning at exactly 10. The municipal inspector, fueled by the urgent safety hazard report I filed, arrived at the exact same time. I could easily picture the beautiful chaos unfolding on my front lawn. The bank appraiser, carrying a clipboard and ready to rubber stamp a $500,000 valuation, was suddenly blocked by a stern city official in a hard hat. Once the municipal inspector forced his way inside and saw the absolute disaster in the basement, it was over. He immediately issued a severe red tag, halting all occupancy and slapping a massive municipal hold directly onto the property deed until the structural issues were legally resolved. The bank appraiser took one look at the bright red municipal stop work order pasted to the front door and walked right back to his car. A legitimate bank will never, under any circumstances, approve a massive commercial equity loan on a property that has an active municipal violation and severe structural defects. The collateral was instantly rendered totally useless. Kendrick's fast-track approval was completely frozen, permanently flagged by the bank's risk management department, and indefinitely suspended. The glorious $500,000 payday he had been viciously mocking me about via text message just yesterday vanished into thin air. He had the forged deed, but he could not extract a single dime of equity from it. Later that evening, my hotel room phone suddenly rang. It was not my personal cell phone. It was the direct landline sitting on the glass bedside table. Kendrick had actually tracked down the exact hotel I was staying at and bypassed my mobile blocks by calling the front desk to be connected to my room. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. I did not say a word. I just hit the record button on my work phone and placed it directly next to the earpiece. Kendrick's voice came through the speaker, but he was not trying to sound like a smooth, confident businessman anymore. He sounded like a completely unhinged animal backed into a corner, breathing heavily into the receiver. He screamed into the phone, demanding to know if I was the one who called the city inspectors. He shrieked that I had intentionally cost him his entire future, and that I was trying to completely bankrupt him on purpose. I calmly replied that he bankrupted himself the moment he decided to steal from a forensic auditor. That completely broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. He dropped his voice to a chilling, aggressive growl. He explicitly threatened to come down to my hotel, drag me out into the street by my hair, and teach me a violent lesson. He said he would make sure I ended up in a hospital bed if I ever interfered with his business deals again. I listened to every single hateful, violent threat pouring out of his mouth. When he finally ran out of breath, I calmly thanked him for the detailed confession and the legally recorded physical threat. I told him he should save his energy because he was going to need it when the real authorities came knocking. Then I hung up the phone. Kendrick had just handed me a recorded terroristic threat. He was completely out of money, out of options, and rapidly running out of time. I woke up the next morning feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Kendrick's recorded physical threat was safely backed up to multiple secure cloud servers, ready to be handed to the authorities when the time was right. But I was not going to wait for him to try and make good on his violent promises. It was time to introduce him to an enemy far more terrifying than a municipal building inspector. It was time to introduce him to the Internal Revenue Service. As a senior forensic financial auditor, I know exactly how the federal tax system operates. I know precisely which red flags trigger an immediate high-priority automated audit. Kendrick had been incredibly sloppy when he set up his fraudulent shell company, Apex Holding Limited. He was so focused on rushing the forged house sale that he ignored basic corporate compliance. I opened my laptop, logged into the federal whistleblower portal, and began drafting a highly detailed reporting document used to flag suspected tax fraud. I systematically laid out every single financial inconsistency. I highlighted the fact that Apex Holding Limited had absolutely no prior revenue history, zero payroll records, and no filed tax returns. Yet it suddenly acquired a luxury real estate asset supposedly fully paid in cash. I documented the massive $180,000 wire transfer to the Nevada fitness influencer, categorizing it as an undeclared, non-deductible personal gift disguised as a corporate business expense. I attached the municipal red tag violation from the basement and the suspended commercial bank loan application. I submitted the entire package directly to the Criminal Investigation Division. Because my professional credentials were tied to the referral, I knew the automated system would immediately flag his company for a severe expedited review. The beauty of Kendrick's sheer laziness was his choice of a registered business address. When he filed the paperwork for his fake company, he did not want to pay for a commercial registered agent or a secure post office box. Instead, he used my mother's affluent Oak Brook address as his official corporate headquarters. He thought it would make his company look more prestigious to commercial lenders. In reality, he had just painted a massive federal bullseye directly onto Patricia's front door. 3 days later, the trap snapped shut. I was sitting in my hotel room reviewing a client portfolio when my newly purchased burner phone received a frantic voice message. I had not blocked Patricia on this specific device, leaving a single line open strictly for gathering intelligence. I pressed play and listened to my mother completely lose her mind. Patricia was hyperventilating into the phone. She said a postal worker had just forced her to sign for a certified priority envelope from the Department of the Treasury. Because the envelope bore her home address, she had ripped it open in a panic. Inside was an official notice of a comprehensive corporate tax audit and a demand for immediate production of financial records for Apex Holding Limited. The letter clearly stated that the business was currently under active review for severe tax evasion and potential money laundering. The document was printed with bold red warnings about heavy financial penalties, asset forfeiture, and potential federal prosecution. My mother's voice cracked as she screamed into the voicemail. She had spent her entire life meticulously cultivating the image of a perfect, wealthy, law-abiding citizen. Now she was holding a federal investigation notice addressed directly to her own home. She frantically begged me to tell her what to do, crying that the government was going to seize her house and throw her in federal prison because of Kendrick's fake company. I did not call her back. I let her stew in her own absolute terror. Instead, I listened to the second part of her voicemail where she accidentally recorded her own background conversation. She had clearly forgotten to hang up the phone before turning her wrath onto Kendrick. Through the muffled audio, I could hear Patricia screaming at the top of her lungs. She was aggressively demanding that Kendrick drive over to her house right this exact second and fix the massive federal disaster he had dragged her into. I could hear Stephanie crying loudly in the background, wailing about how they had absolutely no money left to hire a tax defense attorney. Kendrick's voice echoed through the recording, sounding incredibly panicked and entirely defeated. He was trying to calm Patricia down, stammering about how it was just a routine paperwork error and that his personal accountant would clear it up in a few days. But Patricia was not buying his smooth-talking lies anymore. The ultimate enabler had finally realized that the golden child's husband was a massive legal liability. She shrieked that if the federal agents came to her front door, she would personally hand him over to them just to save herself. The fraudulent family alliance was officially fracturing rapidly, torn apart by the absolute terror of a corporate subpoena. The very next afternoon, I was sitting in the hotel lobby lounge, enjoying a quiet cup of tea, when the concierge approached my table. He politely informed me that 2 family members were waiting at the front desk demanding to see me. I looked across the marble floor and saw Aunt Susan and Uncle Thomas. They had driven all the way downtown from the suburbs to stage a formal family intervention. Instead of hiding in my suite, I waved them over to my corner table. I wanted to see exactly what new narrative my mother had spun to try and save herself from the federal disaster currently unfolding at her house. Aunt Susan sat down heavily in the velvet armchair, clutching her purse. Uncle Thomas stood directly behind her, crossing his arms with a stern, judgmental look on his face. Susan did not bother with pleasantries. She leaned forward and used the exact same patronizing tone she always used when we were children. She told me that this ridiculous vendetta had to stop right now. She said Patricia was practically having a nervous breakdown over some misunderstanding with the tax authorities, and Stephanie was crying herself to sleep every single night. Uncle Thomas chimed in, stating that family always protects family, no matter what mistakes were made. Susan looked me in the eye and demanded that I call the federal authorities, withdraw my malicious audit report, and simply let Stephanie have the house. She actually had the nerve to tell me that I was a highly successful, wealthy woman who could easily afford to buy another property. She argued that Stephanie had absolutely nothing left and needed the house to start over. She placed her hand over mine and pleaded with me to be the bigger person, claiming that making financial sacrifices to help a struggling sister is just what a loving family does. I did not pull my hand away. I just looked at her with a calm, pitying expression. I asked Aunt Susan if making massive financial sacrifices for the family was a core principle she truly believed in. She nodded vigorously, declaring that blood is always thicker than money. I smiled politely. I told her that was a very beautiful sentiment, especially coming from someone who had secretly drained a massive portion of her own retirement fund to pay for my mother's fake medical emergencies. Aunt Susan froze completely. Her hand jerked back from the table as if she had just touched a hot stove. Uncle Thomas dropped his arms to his sides, his stern expression replaced by complete and utter shock. He asked me exactly what I was talking about. I took a slow sip of my tea and laid the absolute truth right out on the table. 2 years ago, Patricia had gone to Aunt Susan sobbing about a series of severe heart palpitations and extremely expensive uninsured cardiac tests. Susan, being the devoted sister she was, had secretly loaned Patricia exactly $40,000 to cover the imaginary hospital bills. Patricia had sworn Susan to absolute secrecy, promising to pay her back with monthly installments that conveniently never materialized. I knew all about this loan because Patricia had accidentally forwarded me a panicked email from Susan last year begging for a repayment update. Susan stammered, her face turning bright red. She quietly admitted that she had lent Patricia the money to save her life. She said Patricia was still struggling to pay it back because she was on a fixed income. I reached into my work bag, pulled out a copy of my deactivated credit card portfolio statements, and slid the papers across the table. I told Susan that my mother had never been to a cardiologist in her entire life. I instructed her to look at the highlighted charges from the exact same month she handed over that $40,000 check. Susan picked up the papers with trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she read the itemized receipts. During the exact same week she claimed to be undergoing life-saving cardiac testing, Patricia had charged a 10-day first-class Mediterranean cruise to my supplementary platinum credit card. She had spent Susan's hard-earned retirement money on custom jewelry, high-end luggage, and private wine tours in Italy, while perfectly healthy. Uncle Thomas leaned over Susan's shoulder, reading the undeniable proof. The color completely drained from his face before being rapidly replaced by a deep, dark red shade of pure, unadulterated fury. I looked directly at my aunt and uncle. I asked them if they still wanted me to drop my hostility and let Patricia and Stephanie steal my house, or if they wanted to drive back to Oakbrook and ask their sister exactly where their $40,000 went. Susan did not say another word to me. She shoved the credit card statements into her purse, stood up from the table, and marched out of the hotel lobby with Uncle Thomas right on her heels. They were not walking like peacemakers anymore. They were marching like soldiers going to war. The protective family army my mother had spent decades building was officially turning against her. By the time the sun set that evening, my mother's carefully curated social empire had completely collapsed. Aunt Susan did not just drive back to the suburbs to confront Patricia privately. She called every single aunt, uncle, and cousin on the drive over, exposing the $40,000 medical fraud and the luxurious Italian cruise. The same extended family members who had bombarded my phone with hateful messages just 48 hours ago were now entirely silent, realizing they had been masterfully manipulated by a pathological liar. Patricia was completely ostracized, locked inside her house, terrified of the federal government and her own siblings. She was entirely useless to Kendrick and Stephanie now. With the Bank of Mom permanently shut down and the extended family turning their backs, the walls were rapidly closing in on my sister and her husband. The Internal Revenue Service deadline for producing corporate financial records was looming closer every single day. Furthermore, the massive commercial equity loan Kendrick had banked his entire future on remained permanently frozen by the bank due to the severe municipal red tag on the basement. He was holding a forged deed to a luxury property, but he was completely starved of liquid cash. He could not pay his mounting legal fees, he could not maintain his fake wealthy lifestyle, and I knew for a fact his expensive mistress had already packed her bags and left him the moment the stolen money stopped flowing. Desperation breeds incredibly foolish decisions. Kendrick knew that a traditional real estate sale was completely out of the question. Any normal home buyer would require a standard mortgage, which meant dealing with another strict bank appraisal and a thorough home inspection that the property would instantly fail. He needed pure, untraceable cash, and he needed it immediately before the federal tax agents started freezing his personal bank accounts. So he bypassed the traditional real estate market entirely. He reached out to an aggressive fast cash property investment firm. These were the types of shady corporate buyers who advertise on cheap local billboards, promising to buy distressed properties in any condition for pure cash within 7 days. Using my forensic tracking software, I monitored the digital footprint of his frantic real estate moves in real time. I watched as he officially listed the property through a shadow network of cash buyers. 2 days later, a representative from a local real estate investment group toured the property. Of course, the investor took one look at the bright red municipal stop work order plastered to the front door and the chaotic, unpermitted disaster waiting down in the basement. The investor knew Kendrick was incredibly desperate. They smelled the blood in the water. The investment group submitted a formal all-cash offer for the property. They offered exactly $400,000. That was less than half of what my beautiful home was actually worth on the open market. It was an absolute insulting lowball offer, designed to take severe advantage of a distressed seller. Any rational homeowner would have rejected it immediately and tried to fix the municipal violations first. But Kendrick was not rational. He was a cornered animal. He and Stephanie eagerly signed the preliminary acceptance documents the very same afternoon. They actually believed they had just pulled off the ultimate financial escape. In their delusional minds, $400,000 in pure cash was still a massive victory. They figured they could use a portion of the money to hire a cheap tax attorney to stall the federal government pocket, the rest to maintain their lavish lifestyle and completely disappear from Chicago to start over somewhere else. Stephanie was so thrilled with this perceived victory that she unblocked my email address just to send me a gloating message. She sent a brief, arrogant email stating that the house was officially entering escrow with a cash buyer. She bragged that by the end of the week, they would have hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank completely untethered from any commercial lenders or nosy city inspectors. She told me to enjoy my miserable, lonely life in my downtown hotel room while she and her husband cashed out and won the ultimate prize. She even thanked me for moving out of the country so they could claim what they rightfully deserved. I read her gloating email twice, a calm smile spreading across my face. I did not reply. I simply forwarded the escrow notification to my secure digital archives. Stephanie and Kendrick thought they had completely outsmarted me. They thought they had found a clever loophole to bypass the frozen bank loan and escape the federal tax auditors. They were rushing headfirst toward the title company to sign the final closing papers, totally unaware that the finish line they were sprinting toward was actually a massive, inescapable trap. The desperate cash sale was the exact move I had been waiting for from the very beginning. On Friday morning, the relentless Chicago rain was beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a high-end title and escrow office downtown. I knew the exact time and location of the closing because the shadow real estate network Kendrick used was incredibly easy to track if you knew which corporate databases to monitor. I arrived 15 minutes after their scheduled appointment began. I wanted to give them just enough time to get completely comfortable, to taste the victory, and to physically hold the fancy silver pens the title agents always provide at closing. I walked past the receptionist without breaking my stride, carrying my heavy leather legal briefcase, and pushed open the solid mahogany door of Conference Room B. The scene inside was exactly as I had pictured it. Kendrick and Stephanie were sitting on one side of a massive glass table. Kendrick was wearing his designer suit, leaning back in his leather chair, with his solid gold Rolex resting conspicuously on the armrest. Stephanie looked incredibly smug, wearing a brand new silk blouse she undoubtedly bought on credit, eagerly watching the escrow officer shuffle a thick stack of final sale documents. Sitting directly across from them was the cash buyer, a slick, fast-talking representative from the aggressive property investment firm. He had his checkbook sitting right next to his elbow, ready to hand over $400,000 in untraceable cash. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, and all four heads snapped in my direction. Stephanie gasped out loud, dropping her pen onto the glass table. Kendrick instantly jumped to his feet, his face flushing with a mix of absolute panic and sudden rage. He pointed his finger at me and yelled at the escrow officer to call building security immediately. He claimed I was a deranged, estranged family member who was stalking him and trying to violently disrupt a private business transaction. The title agent looked completely bewildered, her hand hovering nervously over her desk phone. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge Kendrick's frantic shouting. I walked calmly to the head of the conference table, set my leather briefcase down, and looked directly at the cash buyer. I politely introduced myself as a senior forensic financial auditor. I told him I had absolutely no intention of stopping the transaction by force, but as a professional courtesy, I strongly advised him to pick up his checkbook, walk out of this building, and never look back. The investor scoffed loudly. He leaned forward, flashing an incredibly arrogant smile. He told me he dealt with angry, emotional family disputes over inherited properties every single day. He bragged that his firm specialized in distressed real estate, and that a few unpermitted basement renovations and a municipal red tag did not scare him in the slightest. He confidently stated that he had a massive team of contractors who could clear city code violations in their sleep. He picked up his expensive pen, looked me dead in the eye, and said he was not going to walk away from a highly lucrative real estate deal just because I was upset about the sale price. I smiled warmly at him. I completely agreed that municipal building codes were nothing to be afraid of. Then I popped the brass locks on my briefcase. I did not pull out a massive stack of papers. I did not bring up the forged power of attorney or the IRS audit. I reached inside and pulled out one single federally stamped piece of paper. It was a preliminary environmental soil survey conducted by the Environmental Protection Agency, tied directly to the specific parcel number listed on the deed sitting right in front of him. I slid the document smoothly across the polished glass table. I told the investor that he was absolutely right about the building codes, but I suggested he read the exact federal liability statutes regarding deeply buried toxic chemical waste before he signed his name on the dotted line. The investor rolled his eyes, but glanced down at the paper. I watched his eyes scan the first paragraph. His arrogant smile vanished instantly. His pupils dilated as his eyes darted down to the highlighted section detailing the mandatory federal cleanup costs. Under strict federal law, the moment his investment firm took legal possession of that deed, they would become entirely responsible for a $2.5 million toxic waste remediation mandate that absolutely cannot be discharged in commercial bankruptcy. The investor did not say a single word. He did not ask Kendrick for an explanation. He dropped his fancy silver pen as if it had suddenly caught fire. He grabbed his checkbook, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and practically kicked his chair backward. He scrambled out of the conference room so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet, slamming the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. The room fell into an absolute deafening silence. The $400,000 escape plan had just sprinted out of the building, leaving Kendrick and Stephanie trapped in the nightmare they had built for themselves. The echo of the heavy mahogany door slamming shut seemed to vibrate through the entire conference room. For a few agonizing seconds, Kendrick just stood there staring at the empty leather chair where his $400,000 escape plan had been sitting moments before. Then the shock violently morphed into explosive rage. He turned toward me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer desperation. He slammed both of his fists down onto the glass table, rattling the expensive silver pens and the stack of useless closing documents. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what I had just done. He shrieked that I was a vindictive, psychotic woman who had intentionally ruined his final chance to save his family from complete financial ruin. Stephanie burst into hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands. She wailed that they were completely destroyed, sobbing loudly about the lost cash and the impending federal tax audit. She looked up at me with mascara streaming down her face in thick black lines, blaming me for taking food out of her mouth and destroying her entire life out of pure, spiteful jealousy. I stood at the head of the conference table, my posture perfectly straight, letting their pathetic tantrums wash over me without a single ounce of empathy. The escrow officer, sensing the extreme volatility and potential danger of the situation, quietly gathered her personal belongings, locked her computer screen, and slipped out of the room. She left the three of us completely alone in the soundproof glass box. I reached into my leather briefcase one more time. Kendrick was still yelling frantically, pacing back and forth, threatening to sue me for tortious interference with a business contract. I could not help but laugh out loud at his profound legal ignorance. I asked Kendrick if he honestly believed he could sue someone for preventing the illegal sale of a stolen asset. He scoffed loudly, aggressively jabbing a thick finger in my direction. He yelled that the sale was completely legal because he had the stamped, notarized power of attorney from my mother. He proudly declared that his company owned my luxury house free and clear, and if he could not sell it to that specific investor today, he would just find another desperate cash buyer tomorrow morning. He was clinging so tightly to his fake reality that he was completely blind to the federal trap closing directly around his throat. I walked over to the glass table and picked up the thick stack of sale documents he had been about to sign. I flipped to the first page and read the boilerplate property description aloud. I asked him to listen very carefully to what he thought he was selling. I then looked him dead in the eye and delivered the very first layer of the ultimate reality check. I told him that the luxury suburban home with the wraparound porch and the massive oak trees in the front yard was absolutely never his to sell. Kendrick let out a condescending laugh, crossing his arms and telling me I was completely delusional. He said my name was originally on the deed, which meant my mother had the absolute legal right to sign it over to him when I was out of the country. I shook my head slowly, pitying his sheer incompetence. I explained that 3 years ago, long before I ever left for my corporate auditing assignment in London, I hired a top-tier estate attorney. As a forensic financial auditor, I know exactly how vulnerable personal assets are when you have a highly toxic, greedy family constantly looking for a handout. I told Kendrick that I had permanently transferred the title of that luxury property into a highly secure, ironclad legal entity known as an irrevocable trust. I explained the law to him in slow, simple terms, so his panicked brain could understand. Once an asset is placed inside an irrevocable trust, it is legally removed from my personal taxable estate. I do not own that house anymore. The trust owns it. Therefore, the forged power of attorney my mother used, which only authorized her to act on behalf of my personal self, was completely and utterly useless regarding that specific property. The confident, aggressive posture melted right off Kendrick's body. He uncrossed his arms, his mouth opening and closing, as he struggled to process the devastating legal facts I was laying out before him. He stumbled backward until the back of his knees hit his leather chair, collapsing into it heavily. Stephanie stopped sobbing and stared at me in complete paralyzed horror. I smiled warmly at both of them. I explained that the county clerk's office had legally rejected his forged paperwork for the luxury house on the very first day he submitted it. Kendrick's entire body began to shake visibly. He looked down at the thick stack of closing documents resting on the glass table, his eyes wide with sudden terrifying confusion. If the forged power of attorney did not successfully transfer the luxury home in the suburbs, then what property did his fake shell company actually acquire 3 weeks ago? The heavy mahogany door suddenly flew open, breaking the tense silence in the conference room. It was not the escrow officer returning. It was Patricia. She had been waiting nervously out in the lobby the entire time, banking on this cash sale to fund her own legal defense against the Internal Revenue Service. She had seen the cash buyer sprint past her in the waiting area looking completely terrified, and she knew immediately that something had gone horribly wrong. She marched into the room, her soaking wet umbrella dripping onto the expensive carpet, and demanded to know exactly why the investor had just run out of the building. Kendrick could not even look at her. He remained slumped in his leather chair, staring blankly at the glass table. Stephanie was still weeping into her hands, completely incapable of forming a coherent sentence. Patricia looked at me, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She aggressively demanded to know what lies I had told the buyer to ruin their family's last chance at survival. I calmly told her that I did not tell a single lie. I simply informed Kendrick that my luxury suburban house was safely locked inside an irrevocable trust, and that he had never actually owned it in the first place. Patricia's face contorted with absolute denial. Her hands began to shake violently. She dropped her wet umbrella, unzipped her designer handbag, and aggressively rummaged through it. She pulled out a thick folded document and slammed it down onto the glass table right next to the rejected closing papers. It was the original property deed she had dug out of my old mail months ago. She pointed a trembling finger at the bold black ink at the top of the page. She shouted that my name was printed right there on the official county letterhead. She shrieked that she had legally transferred this exact deed to Kendrick's company using the notarized power of attorney, and that I was just making up fake legal terms to confuse them. I looked down at the crumpled paper. I nodded and agreed with her. I told Patricia that she was absolutely right about the name on the document. I did own that specific deed, and she did successfully transfer it to Apex Holding Limited. But I asked her if she had ever bothered to actually read past the first page. I asked if anyone in this room of supposed real estate moguls had ever bothered to check the parcel identification number or look up the physical address listed in the legal annex. The blank, terrified stares I received confirmed my exact suspicion. They were so blinded by greed that they had completely skipped the most basic step of due diligence. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my work laptop. I opened the screen connected to the title company's guest network and navigated directly to the county assessor's public database. I typed in the exact 14-digit parcel identification number printed on the deed Patricia was clutching. I hit enter and turned the laptop around so the bright screen was facing the three of them. I clicked on the satellite map view and zoomed all the way in. The image on the screen was not a beautiful suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns and massive oak trees. The map showed a desolate, decaying industrial wasteland located in a neighboring county miles away from any residential zoning. Sitting dead center on the cracked concrete lot was a rusted, dilapidated 500-square-foot corrugated metal shack surrounded by a broken chain-link fence. Patricia stared at the screen, her mouth hanging completely open. She whispered, asking what she was looking at. I smiled coldly. I told her she was looking at her golden child's brand new real estate empire. I explained that 2 years ago, I attended a municipal back tax auction as part of a forensic research project for my corporate firm. We were studying distressed municipal assets. I purchased that specific abandoned industrial parcel at the public auction for exactly $1. I kept the deed in my files strictly as a corporate write-off experiment. I looked at Kendrick, whose face had gone completely pale. I told him that when Patricia rummaged through my personal mail, she simply saw a property deed with my name on it and blindly assumed it was the luxury house I was currently living in. Because he was so desperate to launder his fake cartel money, he never verified the asset. I explained that he had successfully used a forged federal document to illegally acquire a rusted metal shack worth exactly $1. But the true beauty of his absolute stupidity was far worse than simply owning a worthless piece of scrap metal. I reminded him of the single document I had just shown the terrified cash buyer. I leaned over the glass table, resting my hands firmly on the edge. I told Kendrick that the rusted shack was built directly on top of a massive illegal chemical dumping ground from the 1980s. By legally transferring that specific deed into his own shell company, he did not just acquire a piece of land. He legally assumed every single environmental liability attached to the soil underneath it. The trap had perfectly closed around them, and they had locked the cage entirely from the inside. The silence in the conference room was absolute and suffocating. The glowing screen of my laptop illuminated the rusted metal shack on the map, a digital monument to Kendrick's overwhelming greed. Patricia stood frozen beside the glass table, her mouth opening and closing silently as her brain completely short-circuited. She had risked her entire social standing, betrayed her own daughter, and committed severe real estate forgery, all to acquire a piece of toxic industrial garbage. Stephanie was hyperventilating now, her hands gripping the edge of the glass table so hard her knuckles were bone white. She looked back and forth between the laptop screen and her husband, waiting for him to magically fix the disaster he had dragged them into. But Kendrick was completely paralyzed. The arrogant swagger, the booming voice, and the condescending smirk were entirely gone. He stared at the rusted chain-link fence on the digital map, his eyes wide with a hollow, empty panic. He was desperately trying to calculate a way out, but his fraudulent house of cards had already collapsed around him. Before anyone could say a single word, the heavy mahogany door of the conference room swung open for the third time. It was not the terrified cash buyer returning, and it was not the escrow officer coming back to retrieve her belongings. Two men walked into the room. They were not dressed in expensive designer suits like Kendrick. They wore highly functional dark tactical windbreakers over collared shirts. They moved with a synchronized, authoritative purpose that immediately drained the remaining oxygen from the room. The taller man in the front held a thick, heavy-duty clipboard, while the second man stood slightly behind him, his eyes scanning the room with cold, professional efficiency. Patricia instinctively took a step back, clutching her wet umbrella like a shield. Stephanie stopped crying and completely froze, her breath catching in her throat. I remained standing exactly where I was, my expression entirely neutral. I knew exactly who these men were. The taller man stopped at the foot of the glass table. He did not introduce himself immediately. Instead, he looked down at his clipboard, flipped past a thick stack of printed reports, and spoke in a loud, commanding voice. He announced that he was looking for the primary corporate officers of a Nevada-based entity registered as Apex Holding Limited. The sheer level of delusion operating inside Kendrick's brain in that exact moment was truly a marvel to witness. Any rational person involved in a massive real estate fraud would have kept their mouth completely shut. A smart criminal would have immediately asked for a lawyer or claimed they did not know what the men were talking about. But Kendrick was not a smart criminal. He was a narcissist who had spent his entire life desperately craving authority and respect. He had spent the last 3 weeks pretending to be a highly successful corporate CEO. Even in the face of complete disaster, his massive ego simply could not resist the opportunity to claim his imaginary throne. Kendrick actually believed these men were municipal officials, or perhaps high-level representatives from the commercial bank sent to personally resolve the red tag issue on his property. In his twisted mind, this was his chance to smooth-talk his way out of the municipal violation and get his $500,000 loan back on track. Kendrick pushed his chair back and stood up. He reached up, straightened his expensive silk tie, and puffed out his chest. He looked the authoritative man right in the eye and projected his voice across the room. He proudly announced that he was the sole managing director and chief executive officer of Apex Holding Limited. He even took a step forward, gesturing to the useless closing documents on the table, and confidently stated that his holding company was the sole legal owner of the property in question. The taller man did not shake Kendrick's extended hand. He did not smile. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his dark windbreaker and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a heavy silver badge shining under the bright fluorescent lights of the conference room. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Harrison. He then pointed to his partner, introducing him as Special Agent Davis. He stated in a clear, uncompromising tone that they were federal investigators operating under the direct authority of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. He explained that their specific division handled high-priority hazardous waste contamination and emergency federal environmental mandates. The confident posture instantly evaporated from Kendrick's body. His extended hand dropped awkwardly to his side. Agent Harrison looked directly at Kendrick, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. He asked Kendrick to verbally confirm for the official federal record that he had just claimed sole corporate ownership and full legal responsibility for the industrial parcel listed under Apex Holding Limited. Stephanie let out a tiny, high-pitched whimper of absolute terror. Patricia closed her eyes, entirely unable to watch the train wreck unfold. Kendrick opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He had just proudly confessed to being the sole owner of a federally monitored toxic waste dump right in front of two sworn federal agents. He had voluntarily handed them the exact legal admission they needed. The federal trap was officially sealed, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. Agent Harrison did not give Kendrick a single moment to walk back his confession. He nodded to his partner. Special Agent Davis unzipped his tactical windbreaker, reached into a secure inner pocket, and pulled out a thick, heavy folder sealed with bright red federal warning tape. He dropped it directly onto the glass table right on top of the useless real estate closing documents Kendrick had been so eager to sign just 10 minutes ago. The heavy slap of the folder hitting the glass sounded like a judge slamming a wooden gavel. Agent Harrison stepped forward, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. He told Kendrick that he was officially being served with a mandatory federal remediation order. He explained that the specific parcel of land registered to Apex Holding Limited was situated directly above a massive, highly toxic groundwater spill caused by an illegal chemical manufacturing plant operating in the early 1980s. For decades, the Environmental Protection Agency had been meticulously tracking the slow migration of the toxic chemical plume. The federal government had finally finalized the containment and cleanup protocol, and the official enforcement mandate was being executed today. Kendrick stammered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep them at his sides. He tried to speak over the federal agent, frantically claiming there had been a massive misunderstanding. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that he had just acquired the property a few weeks ago and that I was the previous owner. He desperately tried to argue that he should not be held responsible for something that happened 40 years ago. Agent Harrison did not even look at me. He kept his cold, unyielding gaze locked entirely on Kendrick. He explained the strict liability clause of federal environmental law. He stated that the federal government does not care who owned the property 40 years ago, or even who owned it 40 days ago. Under the law, the absolute financial burden of the cleanup falls 100% on whoever holds the legal deed on the exact date the federal mandate is issued. He reminded Kendrick that just 2 minutes ago he proudly confessed on the record to being the sole legal owner of that specific property. Kendrick looked down at the red-sealed folder like it was an active explosive device. He asked Agent Harrison, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whisper, exactly how much the remediation was going to cost. Agent Davis answered him this time. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his own clipboard and slid it across the glass table toward Kendrick. The agent stated that the total estimated cost for the mandated hazardous soil excavation, groundwater filtration, and long-term federal monitoring was $2.5 million. He added that under federal law, Kendrick had exactly 30 days to submit proof of liquid funds or secure a commercial bond to cover the entire amount, otherwise the Department of Justice would begin seizing his personal assets. Stephanie let out a gut-wrenching scream. She threw herself against the back of her leather chair, tearing at her own hair. She sobbed violently, wailing that they did not even have $400 in their checking account, let alone $2.5 million. Patricia leaned heavily against the glass wall of the conference room, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, clutching her chest as she gasped for air. Her precious golden child and her supposedly wealthy son-in-law were officially financially ruined for the rest of their natural lives. Kendrick fell to his knees beside the glass table. He reached out and grabbed the edge of Agent Harrison's windbreaker, practically begging the man. He pleaded that his company was completely broke. He swore he would just file for corporate and personal bankruptcy tomorrow morning, and the government could just take the worthless piece of land back. He thought bankruptcy was his ultimate escape route. Agent Harrison looked down at Kendrick with absolute disgust. He stepped back easily, pulling his jacket out of Kendrick's desperate grasp. He delivered the final devastating blow with surgical precision. He informed Kendrick that environmental remediation debts owed to the federal government absolutely cannot be discharged in any form of bankruptcy court. The $2.5 million debt was permanent. It would follow him for the rest of his life. The government would aggressively garnish his wages, seize his bank accounts, and intercept any future tax refunds or legitimate business income until the entire debt was paid in full. The pure, unfiltered terror in Kendrick's eyes suddenly shifted into a frantic, chaotic calculation. He realized the absolute finality of the federal trap. In a moment of sheer desperation, he looked back and forth between the federal agents and the stack of closing documents on the table. He suddenly jumped to his feet, knocking his expensive leather chair backward onto the floor. He pointed his finger directly at Patricia, who was still slumped against the glass wall in a state of absolute shock. Kendrick screamed at the federal agents that the deed transfer was completely illegitimate. He frantically confessed that he never actually had the legal right to buy the property. He shrieked that Patricia had forged the power of attorney signature while I was out of the country, and that the entire real estate transaction was based on massive deliberate fraud. He practically begged the agents to void the deed right then and there, screaming that he was a victim of a family conspiracy. I stood quietly at the head of the table, perfectly content to let him keep talking. In his blind panic to escape the $2.5 million environmental trap, Kendrick had just voluntarily confessed to felony real estate fraud and massive wire fraud directly to federal investigators. He had successfully cornered himself so tightly that his only escape route was to confess to a crime that carried a mandatory prison sentence. Agent Harrison pulled a small digital voice recorder from the front pocket of his tactical windbreaker, tapped a button, and calmly stated the date, time, and Kendrick's exact unprompted confession for the official federal record. Kendrick stared at the small red blinking light on the device, the horrific reality of the situation finally washing over him. By desperately trying to dodge a massive civil penalty, he had just handed the federal government a neatly wrapped confession for felony real estate forgery and wire fraud. He was going to lose his money, and he was undoubtedly going to lose his freedom. The absolute finality of his ruin caused something deep inside his brain to completely snap. Kendrick slowly turned his head toward my mother. Patricia was still sitting on the carpet, her back pressed hard against the glass wall of the conference room, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. Kendrick pointed a trembling finger right at her face. His voice started as a low, dangerous growl and rapidly escalated into a deafening roar. He screamed that this entire disaster was completely her fault. He turned back to the federal agents and shouted that Patricia was a nosy, meddling woman who had deliberately snooped through my private mail while I was thousands of miles away in London. He declared that she was the one who illegally opened my secure envelopes, found the property deed, and hatched the entire psychotic plan to sell it behind my back. He stepped closer to Patricia, towering over her with clenched fists. He shrieked that she was the one who hired the shady notary, that she was the one who physically forged my signature on the legal documents, and that she practically forced him to take the poison deed to save her precious family image. Patricia's terror instantly vanished, replaced by a blinding, venomous rage. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive designer handbag sliding off her shoulder and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She did not cower. She stepped right into his personal space and screamed back with equal ferocity. She shrieked that she only forged the documents because Kendrick was a pathetic broke loser who came crying to her about a fabricated cartel debt. She yelled that he had begged her on his hands and knees for a massive financial bailout because he was far too incompetent to run a legitimate business. She pointed directly at the federal agents and loudly declared that Kendrick was the sole mastermind who set up the fake Nevada shell company to launder the stolen cash. In her desperate attempt to clear her own name, my mother was eagerly supplying the Environmental Protection Agency with all the missing pieces of his criminal money laundering puzzle. Kendrick threw his hands up in the air, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Finding no sympathy or protection from Patricia, he violently pivoted toward his wife. Stephanie was still clutching the edge of the glass table, completely paralyzed by the escalating chaos. Kendrick lunged toward her, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. He blamed her for every single bad decision he had ever made. He screamed that her insatiable greed and her desperate need to look incredibly wealthy on social media had driven him to steal from her own sister. He shouted that if she did not constantly demand five-star resorts in the Maldives and solid gold jewelry, he would never have needed to orchestrate a massive real estate scam in the first place. He cruelly mocked her right in front of the federal agents and her own mother. He said that providing for her was a massive black hole that could never be filled. He even brought up his mistress Amber, loudly declaring that at least Amber actually appreciated the expensive things he bought her, while Stephanie just constantly demanded more. That was the absolute breaking point. The delicate illusion of the perfect golden child completely shattered into a million pieces. Stephanie let out an ear-piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged forward, launching herself directly at Kendrick. She slapped his chest hard, tearing at the lapels of his expensive designer suit, screaming that he was a disgusting, cheating fraud who had entirely ruined her life. Kendrick grabbed her wrists, roughly pushing her backward against the conference table. The heavy glass surface shuddered under the violent impact, sending the useless real estate closing documents scattering across the polished floor. Special Agent Harrison and Special Agent Davis immediately stepped forward, their tactical training seamlessly kicking in. They did not draw their weapons, but they aggressively separated the violently fighting couple. Agent Davis shoved Kendrick heavily back into his leather chair and ordered him to stay seated, while Agent Harrison physically blocked Stephanie from launching another attack. I stood completely silent at the head of the table, watching the glorious, catastrophic implosion of the toxic alliance that had tormented me my entire life. They were no longer a family hiding behind manicured lawns and country club luncheons. They were just three cornered criminals viciously tearing each other apart in a desperate, entirely futile attempt to save themselves from the federal cage I had perfectly built for them. Agent Harrison stood firmly between the fighting couple. He pushed Kendrick back into the leather chair and instructed him not to move another muscle. Agent Davis pulled a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, holding them at the ready. Harrison turned his attention to the digital voice recorder still resting in the center of the glass table. He announced that the situation had officially escalated far beyond a simple environmental liability case. Because Kendrick had just confessed on a federal recording to utilizing a forged legal document to execute a fraudulent real estate transfer across state lines, utilizing a Nevada shell company to launder the proceeds, he had triggered multiple severe federal statutes. Harrison calmly explained that the Environmental Protection Agency works in direct coordination with other federal bureaus when criminal fraud intersects with environmental mandates. He pulled out his radio and contacted the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He requested an immediate dispatch for a white-collar crime unit to process a suspect for severe wire fraud, bank fraud, and felony real estate forgery. Kendrick slumped forward, his face buried in his hands. He began sobbing uncontrollably, the loud, pathetic sounds of a man who suddenly realized his entire life was over. Agent Davis did not show a single ounce of pity. He ordered Kendrick to stand up and turn around. Kendrick slowly rose from the chair, his legs shaking so badly he could barely support his own weight. He turned around, and the sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the quiet conference room signaled the absolute end of his fake real estate empire. The heavy cuffs bit tightly into his wrists right next to his brand new solid gold Rolex. Patricia watched the entire sequence with wide, unblinking eyes. She pressed herself tighter against the glass wall, completely terrified that the agents were going to place her in handcuffs next. She had eagerly provided all the missing puzzle pieces to save herself, but she knew she was still deeply implicated as the person who physically forged the power of attorney. She kept her mouth firmly shut, realizing that every single word she spoke would only dig her grave much deeper. Stephanie, however, could not remain silent. The sight of her husband being physically restrained and read his Miranda rights completely broke whatever fragile grip on reality she had left. She stumbled forward, her knees hitting the carpet right next to the glass table. She looked up, but she did not look at Kendrick or the federal agents. She turned her tear-stained face directly toward me. The sheer audacity of what happened next was almost difficult to comprehend. After spending the last 48 hours screaming at me, calling me a bitter spinster, and actively celebrating the theft of my property, my sister suddenly remembered that we were family. She crawled a few inches forward on the carpet and reached her hands out toward my shoes. She begged me to help them. She wailed that Kendrick was going to be locked in a federal prison for decades, and that she was going to be left completely destitute, with massive legal fees she could never afford. She pleaded with me to use my high salary and my corporate connections to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney for her husband. She actually used the word sister. She cried that I could not just stand there and let her family be destroyed. She promised that if I just paid for the lawyers to get them out of this mess, they would do anything I wanted and never bother me again. I looked down at Stephanie kneeling on the floor of the title company, begging for a financial bailout from the exact same woman she had tried to leave entirely homeless just a few days prior. The absolute hypocrisy was staggering. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt or familial obligation. I looked at her desperate, tear-streaked face, and a genuine, effortless laugh bubbled up from my chest. It was not a loud, dramatic laugh. It was a soft, cold chuckle of pure disbelief. I looked down at my sister and asked her why she thought I would ever spend a single dime of my hard-earned money to defend the man who tried to steal my house. I reminded her that just yesterday she told me to enjoy my miserable life while she cashed a massive check. I told her that the money she was currently begging for was safely locked away in the exact same irrevocable trust they had failed to crack. I reached down, picked up my heavy leather legal briefcase, and secured the brass latches. I looked at Patricia shivering against the wall, and then at Kendrick sobbing in federal handcuffs. I told Stephanie she should probably cancel that luxury vacation to the Maldives. Without another word, I turned around and walked out of the conference room, leaving them entirely to the mercy of the federal government. Walking out of that title company was the last time I saw Kendrick outside of a federal courtroom. The bureaucratic machine of the United States government moves with terrifying speed when environmental hazards and wire fraud are involved. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice officially froze every single bank account tied to Kendrick Stephanie and Apex Holding Limited. The federal agents seized everything. The luxury SUV was repossessed by the bank right out of their driveway in the middle of the night. Stephanie was completely cut off from her stolen wealth, forced to frantically pawn whatever designer handbags and jewelry her husband's mistress had not already gotten her hands on, just to keep the lights on in her rapidly emptying apartment. The tax auditors completely dismantled their lives, leaving my sister with nothing but a mountain of unpayable legal debt and a husband sitting in a federal detention center without bail. But the financial devastation did not stop with Stephanie. Patricia had spent the last 3 months hiding inside her sprawling Oakbrook colonial estate, desperately trying to pretend she was completely unaffected by the massive federal scandal. She truly believed that by throwing Kendrick under the bus in front of the federal agents, she had shielded herself from the financial fallout. She was entirely wrong. What my mother did not know was the true extent of Kendrick's parasitic greed. For the past 2 years, Kendrick had convinced Patricia to let his supposedly brilliant corporate accountants manage her personal estate. She had blindly trusted her golden son-in-law, handing over control of her finances to him. He had not made a single mortgage payment on her Oakbrook home in over 14 months. Instead, he had secretly siphoned every single dollar she gave him, funneling her mortgage money directly into his failing cryptocurrency scams and funding Amber's lavish lifestyle. The commercial bank holding Patricia's mortgage did not care about her prestigious country club status or her tearful excuses about being a victim. They only cared about the massive, undeniable default on her account. Without my supplementary platinum credit cards to fall back on, Patricia had absolutely no way to catch up on the missed payments. The bank officially foreclosed on the property. The final blow came when the county sheriff arrived at her front door with an official eviction notice, forcing her to pack her belongings, while her former wealthy neighbors watched from their perfectly manicured lawns. Her high society friends, who had already heard all about the fraudulent medical loans and the fake Italian cruise through Aunt Susan, completely abandoned her. Not a single person in her affluent circle offered her a place to stay. On a freezing rainy Tuesday evening, I was sitting in the living room of my actual luxury home. The beautiful property I had wisely shielded in the irrevocable trust was quiet, warm, and peaceful. I was reviewing a forensic audit file by the fireplace when a frantic, continuous pounding started at my heavy mahogany front door. I picked up my security tablet and checked the camera feed. Standing on my wraparound porch, surrounded by 4 massive soaking wet suitcases and shivering in her ruined designer trench coat, was Patricia. She looked completely exhausted and entirely defeated. I walked over to the entryway, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and slowly opened the door, intentionally leaving the thick steel security chain firmly engaged. Patricia peered through the narrow gap, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical monologue. She told me the county sheriff had aggressively locked her out of her home that very morning. She cried that Kendrick had completely betrayed her, stealing her mortgage money and leaving her entirely destitute in her old age. She reached her shaking hand through the crack in the door, desperately begging me to undo the chain and let her come inside out of the freezing rain. She practically ordered me to open the door, falling back on her old manipulative tactics by claiming that a daughter's home is always open to her mother in a time of severe crisis. She looked past me at the warm, perfectly decorated living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, and pleaded for a second chance. She swore that if I just let her move into the guest bedroom, we could put all this ugliness behind us and finally be a real loving family again. She told me I was her only daughter, left her only blood, and her only hope for survival. I looked at the water dripping from my mother's soaked hair onto my pristine hardwood floor. She was shivering, waiting for me to undo the heavy steel chain and welcome her into my sanctuary. She truly believed that after a lifetime of treating me like an expendable asset, she could just invoke the word family and instantly erase decades of cruelty. The fireplace crackled warmly behind me, casting a golden glow across the entryway. I did not reach for the lock. I kept my hand firmly on the doorframe, looking at her with absolute emotional detachment. I told Patricia that her definition of family was incredibly convenient. I reminded her of the time I was 16 years old, working weekend shifts at a diner to save up for a used car, while she casually bought Stephanie a brand new convertible for getting mediocre grades. I recounted how when I graduated at the top of my university class, she complained about the drive to my ceremony, but flew first class to Paris just to watch Stephanie fail a short-lived modeling gig. I laid out every single instance of her blatant favoritism, speaking in a calm, measured voice, that cut completely through the sound of the pouring rain. I asked her where her maternal instincts were when she was busy forging my signature on a highly illegal real estate document. I asked her why a loving mother would happily sell her daughter's home to pay off a fabricated cartel debt for a known con artist. She had stood on her sunny patio just a few weeks ago, surrounded by our extended family, and proudly declared that I was entirely dead to her. I reminded her that she threw a measly $2,000 check at my feet and laughed right along with Stephanie when they told me I was suddenly homeless. I pointed out that she had actively aided in stealing my assets to fund Kendrick's mistress and his solid gold watches. I told Patricia she did not come to my door tonight because she suddenly realized the error of her ways. She came because she had completely run out of victims to bleed dry, and her wealthy friends had finally locked her out. Patricia's tearful, desperate expression instantly vanished. The fake remorse evaporated entirely, revealing the exact same entitled, arrogant woman who had tormented me my entire life. She realized her crying routine was not going to work. Her face flushed with sudden, violent anger. She grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany door with both hands and threw her entire body weight against it, desperately trying to force it open. The steel security chain groaned heavily under the sudden impact, but it held firm. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding that I let her inside. She shrieked that she gave birth to me, that she raised me, and that she had absolute authority over everything I owned. She yelled that this house belonged to her by right simply because she was my mother, and she was not going to sleep in the street like a common beggar. I did not panic, nor did I raise my voice to match her hysterics. I simply stepped back from the doorframe and pressed a small wireless panic button attached to my keychain. Within 10 seconds, the heavy side gate of my property swung open. Two massive, highly trained private security guards stepped out from the shadows of the wraparound porch. I had hired an elite security detail the very same day Kendrick threatened me over the hotel phone, ensuring my estate was protected around the clock. The guards marched directly up the front steps, moving with absolute uncompromising authority. Patricia shrieked loudly as the larger guard grabbed her firmly by the shoulders, effortlessly pulling her away from my front door. The second guard began grabbing her soaked, heavy suitcases, hauling them roughly down the wet stone steps, and dumping them onto the dark asphalt of the driveway. Patricia thrashed and kicked, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was the mother of the homeowner and that they were illegally assaulting her. The lead guard simply ignored her protests. He informed her in a stern, professional tone that she was trespassing on private property, and if she did not leave the premises immediately, she would be leaving in the back of a police cruiser. I reached around the corner into my entryway closet and picked up a heavy waterproof canvas bag I had pulled out of storage earlier that evening. I undid the steel chain and pushed the front door wide open. Patricia stopped screaming for a fraction of a second, her eyes lighting up with a brief flash of hope, foolishly thinking I had finally changed my mind. I stepped out onto the covered porch, holding the heavy bag in both hands. I looked down at the woman who had spent 34 years treating me like a second-class citizen. I dropped the heavy camping tent directly at her feet. It landed on the wet wooden floorboards with a loud, heavy thud. I looked her dead in the eye, perfectly mirroring the exact same mocking tone she and Stephanie had used against me at the family barbecue. I told her to take the tent and find a nice spot in the park. I smiled coldly and said, "Now you are homeless." I stepped back inside, pulled the heavy mahogany door shut, and slid the steel deadbolt into place. 1 year has passed since that freezing rainy night when I dropped the camping tent onto my front porch. I am currently sitting behind a massive mahogany desk in a beautiful corner office overlooking the downtown Chicago skyline. Last month, my corporate firm officially promoted me to senior partner. The promotion came with a substantial equity stake in the company and a compensation package that made my previous salary look like mere pocket change. I no longer have to travel out of a suitcase for grueling international audits. Instead, I direct an entire division of forensic financial investigators from the comfort of my own city. My days are filled with high-stakes corporate strategy, and my evenings are entirely my own. The deep, lingering anxiety that used to follow me around like a dark cloud has completely evaporated. Cutting the toxic financial and emotional ties to my family did not destroy me like Patricia confidently predicted. It allowed me to finally thrive. The federal justice system was completely unforgiving to Kendrick. He eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and real estate forgery in a desperate attempt to secure a reduced sentence. It did not matter. The federal judge sentenced him to 7 years in a federal correctional facility, completely without the possibility of early parole. Even worse for him, the $2.5 million environmental remediation mandate remained firmly attached to his permanent record. The government seized every remaining asset he had tried to hide, auctioned off his solid gold Rolex, and garnished all his future earnings. His young fitness influencer mistress vanished the very same day. His bank accounts were frozen, leaving him entirely alone to face the absolute destruction of his fake empire from inside a concrete cell. Stephanie and Patricia did not fare much better in the aftermath. With the sprawling Oakbrook estate fully foreclosed and absolutely zero passive income to rely on, they were forced to rent a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment in a rundown industrial neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The wealthy country club friends completely blacklisted them the moment the fraud scandal became public knowledge. To simply survive and pay rent, they both had to take minimum wage service jobs. Stephanie, the golden child, who once bragged so loudly about booking 5-star luxury resorts in the Maldives, now spends 40 hours a week folding clothes at a discount retail outlet wearing a cheap polyester uniform. Patricia works the cash register at a local grocery store, forced to scan the exact same expensive organic items she used to casually buy using my stolen credit cards. They have tried to contact me multiple times from various prepaid burner phones, crying and begging for financial help or a simple loan to pay their utility bills. I never answer the calls. I delete the voicemails without even listening to them. Tonight is Thanksgiving. My luxury suburban home, safely secured within my ironclad, irrevocable trust, is filled with the rich smell of roasted turkey, fresh herbs, and expensive wine. But the people sitting around my massive dining table are not bound to me by blood. They are my chosen family. They are the loyal colleagues who supported me through the grueling corporate audits, the close friends who stood by me when Patricia launched her vicious social media smear campaign, and the professional mentors who helped me reach senior partner. The house is filled with genuine laughter, mutual respect, and absolute peace. There are no passive-aggressive insults being thrown across the table, no secret agendas being plotted in the kitchen, and absolutely no one trying to steal my hard-earned assets. As I stand at the head of the table to raise my glass, I look at the people who actually value me for who I am, not for what my bank account can provide them. I realize that the greatest lie society ever tells us is that we owe our unconditional loyalty to people simply because we share the same genetics. Family is not a biological obligation. Family is a daily choice to show up, to protect, and to respect one another. I had to lose the people I thought were my family to finally discover the people who truly are. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love you can ever perform is walking over to the front door, looking the toxicity right in the eye, and locking it out forever. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace, tell me your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving betrayal and building an authentic life. Remember to always protect your boundaries, because your peace of mind is the one asset no one is ever allowed to steal. The story of Natalie and her deceitful relatives serves as a powerful reminder that blood relations do not automatically grant someone a free pass to exploit you. For years, Natalie endured the emotional manipulation and financial draining orchestrated by her mother and sister, all hidden under the heavy guise of family loyalty. Society often conditions us to believe that we must endlessly forgive and sacrifice for our relatives, no matter how toxic or destructive their behavior becomes. However, this harrowing narrative shatters that dangerous illusion entirely. The most vital lesson we can extract from this story is that sharing DNA with someone does not obligate you to finance their reckless mistakes, tolerate their abuse, or sacrifice your own hard earned stability to keep the peace. Natalie's ultimate triumph did not just come from her brilliant financial trap or her knowledge of federal environmental laws, it came from her profound emotional detachment. When she systematically deactivated the supplementary credit cards, blocked their phone numbers, and eventually closed her heavy front door on her mother, she wasn't being cruel. She was enforcing a necessary life-saving boundary. We must all learn to protect our peace, our assets, and our mental health with the exact same fierce intelligence that Natalie used to secure her property in an irrevocable trust. True family is a daily choice built on mutual respect and support, not an unconditional license for entitlement and theft. When a relationship only takes and never gives, walking away is not an act of failure, it is an act of profound self-preservation. The greatest revenge against toxic people is simply living a successful, authentic life without them. If you have ever had to build boundaries against toxic family members to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below.